August 28, 1944, 12,000 feet above Belgium. Major Robert Johnson tightened his grip on the control column of his P-47 Thunderbolt, scanning the crystal-clear morning sky with the practiced eye of a veteran with 27 kills to his name. Below him, 300 B-17 Flying Fortresses droned toward their targets in Magdeburg, their contrails painting white lines across Europe's bleeding sky. Johnson had seen everything the Luftwaffe could throw at him: the nimble Bf-109, the brutal FW-190, even the twin-engine destroyers with their devastating rockets. Nothing had prepared him for what happened next. "Bogey, 11 o'clock, level." The radio call came from his wingman, but Johnson had already seen it. A shape moving across the sky at a speed that made no sense. No propeller, no visible means of propulsion. Just a great dart punching through the air at velocities that defied everything he knew about aerodynamics. The German jet passed through his formation before he could even bring his guns to bear. 1 second, empty sky. Next second, a whistling blur. Then nothing but the fading scream of turbine engines and 8 dead B-17 crew members tumbling through the stratosphere in what had been the lead bomber. Johnson pushed his throttle forward, trying to give chase. His Thunderbolt, capable of 440 miles per hour in level flight, began to accelerate. The jet kept pulling away. It wasn't even trying. "Jesus Christ," Johnson breathed into his oxygen mask. What the hell was that? The Messerschmitt Me-262, Schwalbe, the Swallow, had just announced its arrival, and the rules of aerial warfare would never be the same. In level flight, nothing could catch it. Not the P-51 Mustang, not the British Tempest, not the fastest Soviet fighter. At 540 miles per hour, the Me-262 was 120 miles per hour faster than any Allied piston fighter in service. It could attack from any angle, disengage at will, and disappear into the stratosphere before enemy pilots could react. This is the story of aviation's most revolutionary fighter, a weapon that arrived too late to change the war's outcome, but soon enough to change warfare forever. A technological marvel wrapped in catastrophic flaws, a machine that claimed 542 Allied aircraft while fewer than 100 operational examples existed at any moment. The jet that German pilots called their last hope. The jet that Allied pilots called uncatchable. July 26, 1944. Oberleutnant Alfred Schreiber banked his Me-262 through the thin air above Munich, the twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet howling behind him like wolves hungry for blood. Below, the familiar checkerboard of Bavarian farmland stretched to the Alps. Above, endless blue sky that belonged to the Luftwaffe less and less with each passing day. The radar controller's voice crackled through his headset. "Hostile aircraft, bearing 270, altitude 7,000 meters, fast mover, probably Mosquito." Schreiber smiled inside his oxygen mask. Fast mover, the British de Havilland Mosquito, the wooden wonder that German pilots had learned to hate. Powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the Mosquito could outrun almost every German fighter at 380 miles per hour. Pilots called them untouchable ghosts, reconnaissance and bomber variants that came and went as they pleased. But Schreiber wasn't flying a Messerschmitt 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190. He was flying the future. He eased the throttles forward with the gentleness of a man handling nitroglycerin. Too fast, and the temperamental Jumo engines would flame out. Too slow, and he'd never catch his prey. The Me-262 accelerated smoothly, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as the airspeed indicator climbed past 450 miles per hour, then 500, then 530. The Mosquito appeared as a speck against the cumulus clouds, its wooden frame invisible to German radar. The British pilot probably felt safe, cruising at maximum speed, secure in the knowledge that no German fighter could intercept him. He was wrong. Schreiber closed to 800 meters before the Mosquito pilot spotted him and threw his aircraft into a desperate dive. The British plane was fast, but the Me-262 was faster. Schreiber followed, the jet's swept wings cutting through the air with supernatural grace. At 600 meters, he aligned the illuminated crosshairs of his Rev-16B gun sight. The four Mk-108 30mm autocannons in the jet's nose were loaded and ready. Each gun could fire 650 rounds per minute. Each round carried 85 grams of high explosive. But Schreiber was a veteran pilot, and he knew the Mk-108's weakness: low muzzle velocity. The shells traveled at just 540 meters per second, barely faster than a propeller fighter's machine guns. At this closing speed, deflection shooting would be almost impossible. He needed to get closer. 400 meters. The Mosquito was weaving desperately, its pilot throwing the aircraft into violent banks, but the laws of physics were unpardonable. A piston engine needed air to breathe. A jet just needed thrust. At 20,000 feet, the Merlins were gasping. The Me-262's turbojets didn't care. 300 meters. Schreiber found the trigger on his control column. But the Mosquito pilot was good, very good. He threw his aircraft into a split-S maneuver, rolling inverted and diving straight toward the Earth. The negative Gs would have torn most aircraft apart, but the wooden Mosquito held together. Schreiber tried to follow. The Me-262 dove like a stone, accelerating past 550 miles per hour, but the Mosquito was already leveling out at treetop height, using the ground as protection. Schreiber had two choices: continue the pursuit at suicidal low altitude, or break off. He chose survival. The Me-262 climbed back to altitude, its turbojets drinking fuel at a horrifying rate. The Mosquito escaped. But Schreiber had learned something crucial. The jet could catch anything in level flight, but its guns required perfect positioning. Its fuel endurance was abysmal, maybe 60 minutes of combat operations, and at the speeds it generated, shooting accurately was nearly impossible. The first jet combat had ended without a kill, but it had opened a door into a new world of warfare, a world where speed trumped maneuverability, where altitude was absolute protection, where the old rules no longer applied. 12 days later, on August 8, 1944, Lieutenant Joachim Weber would succeed where Schreiber had failed, shooting down a Mosquito PR-9 for the world's first confirmed jet versus aircraft kill. The age of the jet fighter had begun, and Allied bomber crews were about to learn what terror looked like at 540 miles per hour. The intelligence report landed on General Carl Spaatz' desk in England on September 3, 1944. The commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe read it twice, then called for his chief of intelligence. "Is this confirmed?" "Yes, sir. Multiple bomber crews are reporting aircraft with no visible propellers. Speeds estimated between 500 and 600 miles per hour. Gun camera footage shows jet exhausts. The RAF confirms similar encounters." Spaatz studied the blurry photographs, sleek, shark-like shapes with swept wings and engines mounted below them in pods. Beautiful in a predatory way. "How many are operational?" "Unknown, sir. Estimates range from 10 to 50 aircraft, but the number seems to be growing." Spaatz did the mathematics in his head. 50 Me-262s, attacking in coordinated formations, could potentially destroy 150 to 200 bombers per mission. 3 or 4 missions like that, and he'd have to suspend daylight bombing operations. The entire strategic air campaign, the effort that was strangling Nazi Germany's war production, could collapse. "What can our fighters do against them?" The intelligence officer hesitated. "In level flight, sir? Nothing. The jets are 120 miles per hour faster than our best fighters. They can attack and disengage at will." Weaknesses. They seem to have limited endurance, maybe an hour of flight time. We've noticed they're vulnerable during takeoff and landing. That's when they're slow and can be caught. The pilots also seem to struggle with deflection shooting at high speeds. Spaatz picked up a red pencil and began making notes on the report. "Start identifying Me-262 bases. I want fighter sweeps over their airfield at dawn and dusk to catch them when they are most vulnerable. Brief all bomber crews. If you see a jet, do not try to dogfight it. Tight formation, maximum defensive fire, and pray your gunners get lucky." He paused, staring at the photograph. "And get me everything we know about jet propulsion. If the Germans have this, we need it too." What General Spaatz didn't know, what no one in Allied intelligence had yet discovered, was that the Me-262 had first flown in 1941, 3 years earlier. The wonder weapon that could have devastated Allied bomber formations had been delayed by politics, material shortages, and catastrophic engine problems. By the time it reached operational status in meaningful numbers, Germany was already losing the war. But for the bomber crews about to face the Swallow in combat, those historical nuances meant nothing. All they knew was that something impossible was flying through their formations at speeds that made interception meaningless. Captain James McDonald, a B-17 pilot with the 390th Bomber Group, described his first encounter in a letter home. "We were over Brunswick when our ball turret gunner started screaming on the intercom. 'Fighter 6 o'clock high, moving fast.' I looked back and saw this gray shape diving through our formation. No propeller, no wings to speak of, just this dart punching through the sky like God himself was throwing it. It fired once, I don't even know if it hit anything, and then it was gone."
Just gone. 1 second it was there, the next it was a speck 3 miles away. We kept flying. What else could we do? You can't fight what you can't catch. September 1944 marked the beginning of the Me-262's operational deployment in meaningful numbers. German pilots were learning how to fight in the jet age. Allied pilots were learning that technological superiority could trump numerical advantage. And both sides were racing toward a conclusion that Hitler's wonder weapon had arrived exactly late enough to demonstrate the future while being unable to change the present. The jets were coming, and the sky was about to become a very different place. October 1938. Dr. Voldemar Voigt sat in his office at Messerschmitt's design bureau in Augsburg, reviewing specifications that seemed from science fiction rather than military procurement. The Reich Air Ministry wanted a fighter capable of 850 kilometers per hour, 528 miles per hour. Current German fighters could barely reach 380 miles per hour. The specification demanded 1 hour of endurance and operational ceiling above 11,000 meters, 36,000 feet. It needed to be fast enough to catch British reconnaissance aircraft and powerful enough to destroy American bombers that didn't yet exist. Most challenging of all, it needed to be powered by jet engines that hadn't been perfected. Voigt began sketching. His team at Project 1065 worked through the winter of 1938-39, wrestling with problems no one had solved before. Where do you mount engines that produce 1,900 pounds of thrust each? How do you design wings for speeds where conventional airframes would rip themselves apart? What happens to control surfaces when you push past 500 miles per hour? The initial designs were conservative, straight wings, engines embedded in the fuselage, but in March 1940, BMW delivered devastating news. Their 003 turbojet engines would be heavier than expected, much heavier. Mounting them in the fuselage would shift the aircraft's center of gravity so far aft that it would be unflyable. The design team faced a crisis. Months of work were suddenly obsolete. It was Voigt who proposed the radical solution: mount the engines in the cells under the wings, and to compensate for the weight, sweep the wings backward by 18.5 degrees. The decision was made for engineering necessity. No one realized they had accidentally discovered one of the fundamental principles of high-speed aerodynamics. Swept wings delayed the formation of shock waves that caused control problems at high speeds. What started as a fix for weight distribution became a revolution in aircraft design. The Me-262 V1 prototype rolled out of the assembly building in April 1941. Workers stared at it with a mixture of pride and confusion. It looked like nothing that had ever flown before. The fuselage stretched 34 feet 9 inches, longer than a Bf-109 but somehow more elegant. The wings swept back at that distinctive 18.5-degree angle, spanning 40 feet 11 inches. Two massive UMO 004 turbojet engines hung beneath the wings in bulbous nacelles, looking like pregnant sharks attached to the airframe. The nose was dominated by 4 Mk108 30mm autocannons, the heaviest armament of any German fighter. The canopy was a greenhouse of clear panels, offering visibility that made the old Bf-109 cockpit feel like a coffin by comparison. The landing gear was tricycle configuration, with the nose wheel up front. Modern, but strange to pilots trained on tail-dragging fighters. It weighed 8,367 pounds empty. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it tipped the scales at 15,719 pounds, nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109. German test pilots looked at the specifications and wondered if this thing could even get off the ground. April 18, 1941. Fritz Wendel climbed into the Me-262 V1 for its maiden flight. The BMW 003 jets weren't ready, so engineers had fitted a conventional Junkers JUMO 210G piston engine in the nose as backup. The turbojets would be dead weight for this flight, if they could even call it a jet flight with a propeller up front. Wendel advanced the throttle. The piston engine roared. The weird hybrid aircraft accelerated down the runway at Augsburg, and 18 minutes later, it was back on the ground. The piston engine worked fine. The BMW jets never started. For the next 15 months, the Me-262 program stalled. BMW couldn't get their engines to produce reliable thrust. Messerschmitt tried fitting other power plants. Anything to prove the airframe design worked. The project burned through money and resources while Germany fought on two fronts. Finally, in July 1942, Junkers delivered a breakthrough. Their UMO 004A turbojet had passed endurance tests. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it ran. July 18, 1942, Leipheim Airfield. The Me-262 V3 prototype sat on the runway with two JUMO 004A engines mounted under its wings. No backup piston engine this time. Pure jet or nothing. Fritz Wendel ran through his pre-flight checks. The engines were already hot, literally. The turbine sections glowed dull red even at idle. The cockpit smelled of aviation fuel and burning metal. Tower, this is Victor 3, ready for flight.
Victor 3, you are cleared for takeoff. Good luck. Wendel eased the throttles forward with infinite care. Too fast, and the engines would surge and flame out. The turbojets spooled up with a rising shriek that made conventional engines sound like whispers. The Me-262 began to roll. At 120 kilometers per hour, Wendel pulled back on the stick. The nose wheel lifted. At 180 kph, the main gear left the Earth. The Me-262 was flying on pure jet power. The flight lasted between 12 and 20 minutes. Accounts vary, but when Wendel brought the prototype back down, he was grinning like a madman. "It flies like it's been shot from a gun," he reported. "Smooth, fast, nothing like I've ever experienced." The world's first operational jet fighter had flown. But transforming that experimental prototype into a combat-ready weapon would take another 2 years. 2 years Germany didn't have. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler climbed out of his Me-262 after his 5th combat mission, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the October cold. Ground crew rushed to inspect the aircraft, and what they found made their blood run cold. The left engine's turbine section was glowing cherry red. Metal fatigue cracks spiderwebbed across the compressor blades. The engine had 23 hours on it, nearly its entire operational lifespan. "This one's done," the crew chief announced. "We'll need a replacement." Stiegler stared at the dying engine. "We just installed that one 3 weeks ago." "Welcome to the 262, sir. The engines are made of aluminum and prayers. Sometimes the prayers fail first." The Junkers UMO 004B1 turbojet was the Me-262's greatest achievement and its fatal weakness. It was the world's first mass-produced axial-flow turbojet engine, a stunning technological accomplishment that pushed 1,980 pounds of thrust through 8 compressor stages and a single turbine stage. In a perfect world, with perfect materials, it might have been revolutionary. But Germany in 1943-44 didn't have access to perfect materials. The UMO 004 design called for turbine blades made from nickel-cobalt superalloys, metals that could withstand the 1800-degree Fahrenheit temperatures inside the engine.
These alloys were the key to making jet engines practical. British and American engines used them extensively. Germany had almost none. The strategic metals, nickel, cobalt, molybdenum, came from overseas sources that were now completely cut off by the Allied blockade. German engineers were forced to improvise. They redesigned the turbine blades to use mild steel coated with aluminum. It was a desperate compromise, and everyone knew it. The aluminum coating would protect the steel from oxidation, but only temporarily. At operating temperatures, the coating would degrade. The steel underneath would weaken. The blades would develop microfractures, then catastrophic failures. The numbers were brutal. A UMO-004B engine needed complete overhaul after 25 hours of operation. Absolute replacement after 35 hours maximum. Early production engines sometimes failed after a single flight. Compare that to Allied engines. The Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the P-51 Mustang was expected to last 300 to 500 hours between overhauls. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 in the P-47 could run for 400 hours. German jet pilots were flying with time bombs attached to their wings. The consequences went beyond just reliability. Fuel consumption was catastrophic. Each UMO-004B burned fuel at twice the rate of a twin-engine piston fighter. The Me-262's internal tanks held 2,000 liters, enough for just 60 to 90 minutes of operational flight time, including takeoff, combat, and landing. If you encountered the enemy at your operational limit, 30 minutes from base, you had maybe 10 to 15 minutes of combat before you had to start conserving fuel for the flight home. Get into an extended engagement, and you'd run dry before reaching friendly territory, and that was assuming both engines kept running. Lieutenant Walter Hagener discovered the engine's temperamental nature on November 3, 1944, during a bomber interception near Leipzig. He was diving on a B-17 formation when his left engine suddenly lost power. The turbine had overheated and partially seized. Flying on one engine, the Me-262 became a pig. It wanted to roll left constantly, fighting Hagener's inputs. His speed dropped from 450 miles per hour to 280 miles per hour, slow enough for American P-51 escorts to catch him.
3 Mustangs latched onto him. Hagener pushed his remaining engine to maximum power, praying it wouldn't flame out. The Me-262 had enough speed on one engine to stay ahead, barely, but he was bleeding altitude and running low on fuel. He made it back to base with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining. When ground crew inspected the failed engine, they found turbine blades that had literally melted and fused together. "You're lucky it didn't explode," the crew chief told him. "We've had 3 pilots die when engines came apart in flight. Turbine fragments went through the fuselage like shrapnel." The engine problems shaped everything about Me-262 operations. Pilots learned to nurse their throttles, advancing power slowly to avoid compressor stalls. Rapid throttle movements could cause fuel surging, excessive temperatures, and instant flameouts. In combat, where quick power changes meant the difference between life and death, this limitation was potentially fatal. Takeoff was particularly dangerous. The engines needed time to spool up to full power. If one engine flamed out during the takeoff roll, the asymmetric thrust would flip the aircraft into an uncontrollable ground loop. Several pilots died this way, their Me-262s cartwheeling across airfields in balls of fire. Landing was almost as bad. The engines took time to respond to throttle inputs. If you needed to execute a go-around, pulling up to avoid a crash, the engines might take 5 to 10 seconds to deliver full power. That delay killed pilots who would have survived in conventional fighters. Yet despite these horrific flaws, the UMO-004B represented a stunning achievement. Germany had taken jet engine technology from experimental prototypes to mass production in just 3 years. They had solved problems of materials, metallurgy, and manufacturing that would take other nations years to master. By war's end, German industry had produced over 6,000 UMO-004 engines, more jet engines than the rest of the world combined. They just couldn't make them reliable enough to change the war's outcome.
When Allied technical teams captured Me-262s after Germany's surrender, British and American engineers were stunned by the sophistication of the UMO-004 design. It became the template for post-war jet engines worldwide. The Soviet MiG-15's RD-45 engine was essentially a reverse-engineered UMO-004. Early British jets borrowed heavily from the German design. The Me-262's engines were simultaneously a triumph of engineering and a monument to the reality of resource scarcity in total war. They could push an aircraft to 540 miles per hour. They just couldn't do it reliably, or for very long. Technical Sergeant Joseph Murphy crouched in the ball turret of his B-17 Flying Fortress, scanning the sky through his twin 50-caliber machine guns. It was March 18, 1945, and 37 Me-262 jets were about to teach him why conventional defensive tactics meant nothing against speed. The German jets came from directly ahead, a frontal attack that gave Murphy the best possible shot. He opened fire at 800 yards, his twin 50s hammering out 1,300 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds reached out toward the approaching jet like angry fireflies. The Me-262 didn't even wobble. It just kept coming, accelerating through Murphy's fire like a shark through baitfish. At 500 yards, the nose of the jet lit up with yellow-orange muzzle flashes. 4 Mk-108 30mm autocannons spoke simultaneously. The pilot ahead of Murphy, a close friend named Charlie Patterson, simply ceased to exist. 1 second, his B-17 was there, formation perfect, 7 crew members going about their business. The next second, it was disintegrating like a target at a firing range. The left wing separated from the fuselage, cartwheeling backward through the formation. The nose section split open, spilling crew members into the frozen stratosphere. The tail broke free, tumbling end over end. What remained of the central fuselage exploded in a ball of aviation fuel and oxygen. 4 hits, maybe 5. 2 seconds of firing time. 7 men dead before they knew they were under attack. The Mk-108 autocannon was specifically designed for bomber destruction. Each gun fired 650 rounds per minute, relatively slow by machine gun standards, but it wasn't the rate of fire that mattered. It was what each round carried. The 30mm shell weighed 330 grams, nearly 3/4 of a pound. Inside that projectile, 85 grams of RDX explosive waited to detonate. When the shell hit, a tiny contact fuse triggered the explosive charge with enough force to tear apart structural aluminum like tissue paper. German testing determined that an average of 4 hits would destroy a B-17 Flying Fortress. 1 or 2 hits could down a single-engine fighter. The 4-gun nose installation on the Me-262 gave pilots 100 rounds for the upper pair of cannons and 80 rounds for the lower pair. At 650 rounds per minute, that translated to about 9 seconds of sustained fire from all 4 guns, assuming you fired continuously, which no pilot would do. In practice, pilots fired in 1 or 2 second bursts. That gave them maybe 6 to 8 firing opportunities per mission. But there was a catch, a potentially fatal catch. The Mk-108's muzzle velocity was only 540 meters per second, or 1,772 feet per second. That sounds fast until you compare it to conventional weapons. The American 50-caliber Browning machine gun fired projectiles at 2,900 feet per second. British 20mm Hispano cannons hit 2,850 feet per second. The slow muzzle velocity meant the shells took longer to reach their target, dropping significantly due to gravity and drag. At typical combat ranges, the shell trajectory resembled a rainbow more than a laser beam. This made deflection shooting, firing at a moving target, incredibly difficult. The Me-262 might be closing on a bomber at a combined speed of 400–500 miles per hour. At those velocities, the time window for accurate shooting was measured in fractions of a second. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown, who flew captured Me-262s after the war, described the problem. You whack in at your bomber at 500 miles per hour closure rate and you only had 2 seconds firing time. Now in 2 seconds you can't sight properly. You can fire randomly and hope for the best.
German pilots developed specialized tactics to overcome this limitation. The roller coaster attack became standard. Approach from 1,800 meters above the bomber formation, beginning a shallow dive from 5 kilometers behind. Pass through escort fighters at high speed, too fast for interception, then pull up sharply 450 meters below the bombers. Level off 1 kilometer astern with exactly 150 kilometers per hour overtaking speed. This gave optimal firing position. The slower closure rate meant more time to aim. The 4 Mk-108s could pour shells into the bomber's vulnerable belly. Breakaway at 200 meters to avoid collision and debris. Zoom climb to altitude using excess speed. Repeat. When executed perfectly, this attack was devastating. When executed imperfectly, which was most of the time, especially with inexperienced pilots, it resulted in wasted ammunition and missed opportunities. Some Me-262 variants addressed the shooting problem with a different solution, the R4M air-to-air rockets. 24 of these 55mm rockets could be mounted on underwing racks. Each rocket carried a 520-gram warhead, significantly more explosive than the Mk-108 shells. The tactic was brutally simple. Fire the entire salvo of 24 rockets at a tight bomber formation from outside defensive gun range. The rockets spread in a pattern that turned probability into certainty. 1 or 2 rocket hits could destroy a heavy bomber. The odds of getting at least some hits when firing 24 rockets at a formation of 50 bombers were excellent. On April 10, 1945, Me-262s equipped with R4M rockets attacked a formation of B-17s near Berlin. Ground witnesses reported seeing the rockets streak through the bomber formation like a swarm of angry hornets. 10 B-17s went down in less than 90 seconds. But the R4M system had its own problems. The rockets were unguided, with accuracy that degraded rapidly beyond 1,000 meters. They required specialized aiming that few pilots mastered. And mounting them created additional drag that reduced the Me-262's already limited endurance. The fighter-bomber variant, the A2A Sturmvogel, was even more problematic. It could carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, but to do so, engineers had to remove 2 of the 4 Mk-108 cannons to maintain weight and balance. This turned the Me-262 into a fast bomber that couldn't effectively defend itself in air combat. Hitler's insistence on the bomber variant diverted approximately 30% of Me-262 production away from the interceptor role where the aircraft excelled. These fighter bombers achieved relatively few successes and represented a massive waste of resources. The ultimate irony, the Me-262's weapons were potentially war-winning, but only if pilots could get into position to use them effectively. The combination of high closing speeds, low muzzle velocity, and limited firing time meant that even experienced aces often missed their targets completely. Hauptmann Franz Shaw, the top Me-262 ace with 17 jet kills, estimated that he fired over 3,000 rounds of 30mm ammunition to achieve those victories, an average of nearly 200 rounds per kill. Given that he only had 360 rounds total in his aircraft, that meant multiple sorties per victory. When the Me-262 hit its target, the results were catastrophic. When it missed, which was most of the time, those expensive 30mm shells fell harmlessly to earth, wasted. The devastation was real. The efficiency was not. And in total war, efficiency mattered more than potential.
Lieutenant Hans Fay climbed into the cockpit of the Me-262 for his first solo flight on a gray morning in February 1945. He had 300 hours in propeller fighters, Bf-109s mostly, and was considered an experienced pilot. The instructor who strapped him in gave him final advice. Don't touch the throttles quickly. Don't dive too steeply. Don't turn too hard. Don't run out of fuel. And for God's sake, don't crash. We only have 2 training aircraft for this entire unit. Fay nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. The instructor patted his shoulder and climbed down. There was no 2-seat trainer variant available. Most Me-262 pilots made their first jet flight solo, learning from written notes and whatever oral briefings exhausted instructors could provide. He reviewed the start sequence. Both engines needed to be manually rotated by ground crew before starting. The turbines had to be turning before fuel was introduced, or you'd flood the engine. Fuel on, ignition on for the first engine, wait for it to spool up to idle, repeat for the second engine. The Jumo 004B engines came to life with their characteristic rising shriek, turbines spinning up to 8,000 RPM. The whole aircraft vibrated. They checked his instruments. Oil pressure, normal. Fuel flow, steady. Engine temperature climbing rapidly toward operational range. He released the brakes and eased the throttles forward with the delicacy of a surgeon. The Me-262 began to roll. Unlike tail-dragging fighters, the tricycle landing gear meant he could see the runway ahead, a luxury he'd never experienced. At 120 kilometers per hour, the nose wheel lifted slightly. At 180 kilometers per hour, he pulled back on the stick and the aircraft left the earth. The sensation was nothing like a propeller fighter. No torque trying to roll the aircraft left, no propeller wash buffeting the tail. Just smooth, linear acceleration that kept building. The airspeed indicator climbed past 350 kilometers per hour, then 400, then 450. He was at 3,000 feet and still accelerating. He leveled off and tried a gentle turn. The aircraft responded smoothly, almost too smoothly. It wanted to keep turning, requiring opposite pressure to stop. He pulled back for a climb. The Me-262 went up like an elevator, the altimeter unwinding faster than he'd ever seen. Then he made his first mistake. He tried to level off by pulling the throttles back quickly, the instinctive response from his propeller fighter training. The left engine immediately surged, the temperature gauge spiking into the red. The compressor stalled with a sound like a backfiring truck. The engine lost power. Faye's heart hammered. One engine, 3,000 feet, 10 kilometers from base. He eased the right throttle back slowly, painfully slowly, and trimmed the aircraft for single-engine flight. The Me-262 wanted to roll left, but he could control it. He set up for landing, his airspeed higher than he was comfortable with. The aircraft ate up runway distance. He touched down hard, too hard, bouncing once before settling. The nose wheel collapsed on the second impact, and the Me-262 skidded to a halt in a shower of sparks. Faye sat in the cockpit, uninjured but shaking. Ground crew ran toward him. The instructor arrived moments later, his face a mixture of relief and fury. "What happened?" "I pulled the throttle back too fast. The engine stalled." The instructor's expression softened slightly. "You're the third pilot this week to do that. The jets don't forgive ham-fisted flying. You need to treat those throttles like they're made of glass." That single training flight taught Faye more about the Me-262's nature than any briefing could have. The jet was fast, almost impossibly fast, but it was also unforgiving. It required a completely different mindset than propeller fighters. Combat would be even more unforgiving. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff watched the American bomber formation through his cockpit canopy, counting aircraft. At least 300 B-17s plus another 200 P-51 Mustangs escorts. His unit had 28 operational Me-262s. The mathematics were depressing. Steinhoff was a veteran with 176 kills on the Eastern Front. He'd flown over 900 combat missions. He'd survived 4 years of warfare that had killed most of his friends. And now, in March 1945, he was learning to fight all over again. The Me-262 wasn't a better version of the Bf-109. It was a completely different weapon that required completely different tactics. Speed was everything. At 540 miles per hour, the jet could outrun any Allied fighter, but only if you maintained energy. Turning fights were suicide. The Me-262 bled speed in turns faster than conventional fighters. Get slow, and P-51s would be on you like wolves on a wounded deer. Altitude was life. The jet's performance improved with altitude. At 30,000 feet, it was untouchable. Below 10,000 feet, it was vulnerable. Steinhoff's standing orders were clear. Never engage below 20,000 feet unless you had no other choice.
Fuel was the enemy. The Jumo 0004B engines drank fuel like a dying man gulps water. From engine start to shutdown, you had maybe 75 minutes. Subtract time for taxiing, takeoff, climb to altitude, and return, you had perhaps 20 minutes of combat time. 20 minutes to find the enemy, position for attack,
engage, and disengage. And you had to do it while babying temperamental engines that could flame out without warning. Steinhoff pushed his throttles forward, smoothly, carefully, and his flight of 4 Me-262s accelerated toward the bomber formation. The P-51 escorts spotted them immediately and turned to intercept, but the jets were already at 32,000 feet and accelerating through 480 miles per hour. The Mustangs, struggling at that altitude, couldn't climb fast enough to catch them. This was the tactical advantage. Approach from high altitude, build speed in a shallow dive, blow through the fighter's screen before they could react, attack the bombers with a single pass, then zoom climb back to altitude using excess speed. The roller coaster attack. Steinhoff selected a B-17 in the formation's lower right edge, a straggler with visible engine damage trailing white smoke. Wounded aircraft were priority targets. They couldn't maintain formation, couldn't benefit from overlapping defensive fire. He rolled inverted and began his dive, the altimeter unwinding rapidly. 25,000 feet, 500 miles per hour. The B-17 grew larger in his Reeve gun sight. He could see the ball turret tracking toward him, twin .5 caliber searching for an angle. Too slow. The gunner's training was based on fighting aircraft that moved at 250, 300 miles per hour. Steinhoff was doing 520 miles per hour and accelerating. At 800 meters, the ball turret opened fire. Tracer rounds reached toward him, falling behind as the gunners struggled with deflection angles he'd never practiced. The streams of fire looked like they were moving in slow motion compared to the jet's speed. 400 meters. Steinhoff's finger found the trigger. The 4 Mk-108 cannons hammered, the aircraft shuddering as 30mm shells streamed toward the bomber. He held the trigger for 1 second, maybe 2, watching his rounds walk across the B-17's fuselage. 3 hits on the left wing. The fuel tank exploded in an orange fireball. The wing folded upward, torn free by aerodynamic forces. The bomber snap-rolled to the left, breaking up as it fell. Steinhoff pulled hard on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The Me-262 bottomed out at 18,000 feet and began climbing. The airspeed indicator showed 480 miles per hour. The P-51s were still trying to turn toward him. He'd be back at 30,000 feet before they could position for an attack. 1 bomber destroyed, less than 30 seconds from engagement to escape. But Steinhoff felt no satisfaction. He'd just killed 7 men, and it hadn't changed anything. The bomber formation kept flying. The mission would continue. 300 bombers would drop their loads on German cities, killing thousands. 1 kill meant nothing. That was the strategic reality that no amount of technological superiority could overcome. The Me-262 could destroy individual aircraft with a ruthless efficiency, but there were never enough jets, never enough pilots, never enough fuel to make a strategic difference. And time was running out. Lieutenant Chuck Yeager spotted the Me-262 from 15,000 feet on November 6, 1944. The German jet was on final approach to its airfield. Gear down, flaps extended, speed reduced to maybe 150 miles per hour. Vulnerable. Yeager was flying a P-51 Mustang, theoretically 120 miles per hour slower than the jet. But right now, that didn't matter. The jet was committed to landing. It couldn't accelerate quickly with gear and flaps extended. The temperamental Jumo engines needed several seconds to spool up from idle to full power. Those seconds were enough. Yeager opened fire at 300 yards, his 6.5 caliber Brownings hammering. The convergence pattern caught the Me-262 across the fuselage and left wing. The German jet staggered, rolled left, and impacted the ground at 200 miles per hour, exploding in a ball of fire. The Hunter had been caught at its most vulnerable moment. Allied pilots learned quickly that the Me-262's weaknesses made it killable, despite its speed advantage. Takeoff and landing were death traps. The jet needed long runways and high speeds, 180 miles per hour minimum for takeoff, 150 miles per hour for landing.
During these phases, it was slower than any Allied fighter and couldn't maneuver.
Fighter sweeps over known Me-262 bases became standard procedure. P-51 Mustangs and Hawker Tempests would orbit German airfields at dawn and dusk, waiting for jets to take off or return from missions. The Germans tried to counter with flak alleys, concentrations of more than 150 anti-aircraft guns surrounding jet bases, but determined Allied pilots still got through. On February 25, 1945, 6 Me-262s were destroyed by P-51s during takeoff from a single base. The second vulnerability was fuel. Me-262 pilots who got into extended engagements or had to fly defensive maneuvers quickly found themselves running on fumes. Several jets were abandoned in flight when pilots realized they'd never make it back to base. Others attempted forced landings on roads or fields, usually with fatal results. The third vulnerability was the pilot's inability to dogfight. The Me-262 lost energy rapidly in turning engagements. Allied pilots learned to force jets into sustained turns, bleeding their speed advantage. Once a jet was down to 300 miles per hour, it became fair game for conventional fighters. Major George Preedy, flying a P-51, demonstrated this on December 25, 1944. He caught an Me-262 at 15,000 feet and forced it into a turning fight by positioning his Mustang to cut off the jet's escape angles. Every time the German pilot tried to extend away, Preedy was there to block him. The Me-262's speed dropped from 450 to 350, then 300. At 280 miles per hour, Preedy got his shot. One burst from his Brownings and the jet's right engine exploded. The pilot ejected. But perhaps the most effective counter to the Me-262 was attacking the infrastructure. Allied medium bombers systematically targeted jet production facilities and airfields. In September 1944 alone, 60 Me-262s were destroyed on the ground at Augsburg. In March 1945, another 60 were destroyed at Obertraubling and 30 at Leipheim. You can't fly an aircraft that's been blown up in its hangar. Of approximately 370 documented Me-262 losses, mechanical failure and pilot error accounted for 39.5%, more than combat losses to enemy fighters at 42.7%. The unreliable Jumo 004B engines killed more Me-262s than Allied guns. Major Walter Novotny, the famous ace with 258 victories, died on November 8, 1944, after an engine failure during combat forced him to bail out while under attack by P-51s. The jets could be beaten, and increasingly, they were. The conference room in the Reich Chancellery was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Adolf Hitler stood at the head of the table, his face flushed with rage as he listened to Adolf Galland's report. Mein Führer, the Me-262 is ready for mass production as a fighter interceptor. We estimate— No. Hitler's voice was flat, final. I have seen this aircraft. I asked if it could carry bombs. I was told yes. Then I asked how many are being produced as bombers. I was told none. He slammed his palm on the table. Why am I surrounded by fools? Galland, Germany's top fighter ace and inspector of fighters, chose his words carefully. Mein Führer, the Me-262 is designed as an interceptor. Its speed allows it to devastate enemy bomber formations. As a bomber, it will have to give up half its cannon armament and— I don't care about your technical objections. Hitler's voice rose to a shout. The British and Americans are preparing to invade. When they come, I need fast bombers to attack their landing beaches. The Me-262 will be produced exclusively as a bomber. This order is final. Anyone who refers to this aircraft as a fighter will be court-martialed. The date was November 1943. The Me-262 had been flying since 1942. Mass production was ready to begin. Hitler's bomber directive would delay operational deployment by crucial months. But the reality was more complex than the myth of Hitler's delay. The Me-262's road to operational status was paved with obstacles that went far beyond one man's stubbornness. The engine problem was fundamental. From 1941 to mid-1944, the Jumo 004 was simply not reliable enough for combat operations. Early engines lasted 10 to 15 hours before catastrophic failure. Strategic material shortages meant German engineers couldn't access the nickel-cobalt superalloys needed for turbine blades that could withstand operational temperatures. Hermann Göring's decision in February 1940 to slash jet engine development to just 35 engineers caused an estimated 12 to 18-month delay in engine development, probably more significant a delay than Hitler's bomber directive. The airframe itself needed refinement. Early prototypes suffered from landing gear failures, control surface problems, and wing structural issues. Testing and modification took time that Germany didn't have but couldn't avoid. Allied bombing disrupted production repeatedly. The August 17, 1943 raid on Regensburg killed 400 Messerschmitt employees and forced the design bureau to relocate to Oberammergau. Production delays from this single raid exceeded 6 months. Pilot training was a disaster. Most Me-262 pilots received less than 10 hours of jet training before being thrown into combat. The lack of two-seat trainers meant pilots made their first jet flights solo, learning critical procedures through trial and error. Many died during training.
Fuel shortages limited training even further. By late 1944, Germany was producing plenty of aircraft but couldn't fuel them. Training flights were cut to bare minimums. Combat pilots arrived at operational units with minimal jet experience. The bomber directive did waste resources. Approximately 30% of Me-262 production went to the fighter-bomber variant, which achieved little. But even if all those aircraft had been interceptors, the fundamental problems remained. Unreliable engines, limited fuel, insufficient trained pilots, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The counterfactual is tantalizing. What if the Me-262 had reached operational status in late 1943 before long-range P-51 escorts arrived? German fighter losses would have been dramatically reduced. American bomber losses would have been far higher. D-Day might have been postponed into late 1944 or early 1945. But historians largely agree that even with earlier deployment, Allied industrial superiority would have prevailed. America was producing fighters and bombers faster than Germany could train pilots. The fuel shortage would have grounded Me-262s regardless of their technical capabilities. The delay mattered, but it didn't change the ultimate outcome. Germany was losing the war by 1943, and no single weapon, no matter how revolutionary, could reverse strategic defeat. Oberlieutenant Franz Schall climbed to 26,000 feet in his Me-262, leading 37 jets from Jagdgeschwader 7 toward the greatest air battle the jets would ever fight. Below him, stretched across 50 miles of sky, 1,221 American bombers and 632 escort fighters droned toward Berlin. It was the largest Me-262 operation of the war. 37 jets against nearly 2,000 Allied aircraft. Schall's radio crackled with position reports. The Americans were in their standard box formations, B-17s and B-24s stacked from 20,000 to 28,000 feet. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts flew escort, covering the bombers like a steel curtain. All aircraft, this is Red Leader. Execute roller coaster attack. Target the lead formation. Break on my command. The 37 Me-262s dove toward the bomber stream. The P-51 escorts turned to intercept, but the jets were already past them, accelerating through 500 miles per hour. A few Mustangs fired, their bullets falling uselessly behind the speeding jets. Schall selected a B-17 and began his firing run. 400 meters. His Mk-108 cannons lit up. The bomber's waist gunner fired back, tracers reaching toward him. The shells walked across the B-17's right wing, 2 hits. The wing tanks exploded. Breakaway. Zoom climb back to altitude. Behind him, other Me-262s were making their attacks, the sky filled with contrails, tracer fire, and falling aircraft. A B-17 broke up in mid-air, its crew spilling out like seeds from a broken pod. Another fell away from the formation, trailing fire. But the American formations kept flying. The escorts positioned themselves more aggressively. And the flak. The flak filled the sky with black bursts that didn't care about friend or foe. An Me-262 took a direct flak hit and disintegrated, scattering parts across 3 miles of sky. Another jet, damaged by a lucky shot from a B-17 tail gunner, fell away smoking. A third ran out of fuel during combat and had to make an emergency landing in a field. The pilot survived, but the aircraft was a total loss. The battle lasted 23 minutes. When it was over, 13 Allied aircraft had been destroyed, 12 bombers and 1 fighter. Germany had lost 3 Me-262s. By traditional metrics, it was a stunning German victory, a 4-to-1 kill ratio. The jets had demonstrated their devastating potential.
But Shaw understood the mathematical reality as he flew back to base. 37 jets had destroyed 13 aircraft out of 1,853, less than 1%. The remaining 99% had continued to their targets and bombed Berlin into rubble. Even in their greatest single-day achievement, the Me-262s had been strategically irrelevant. The bombers kept coming, day after day, week after week, and there were never enough jets, never enough pilots, never enough fuel to stop them. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider flew his first and only combat mission on April 14, 1945. He had 12 hours of jet training, barely enough to take off and land safely. His unit was down to 6 operational aircraft and 9 pilots, fuel for perhaps 2 more missions. He took off from a cratered airfield near Leipzig, the runway pockmarked with bomb damage hastily filled. 3 other Me-262s managed to get airborne, 2 more suffered engine failures during takeoff. They climbed to 20,000 feet and immediately encountered a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts, at least 20 of them. The American pilots saw the jets and turned to attack.
Brettschneider's section leader's aircraft was hit first, the right engine exploding. The jet rolled inverted and dove into the earth. Brettschneider tried to run. The jet's speed should have saved him, but his left engine began surging, temperature in the red, power fluctuating. A P-47 latched onto him. The American pilot was good, using diving speed to temporarily match the jet's velocity. Brettschneider tried to turn. Fatal mistake. The Me-262 bled speed in the turn. The P-47's 850 caliber Brownings opened up. The cockpit exploded around him. The instrument panel shattered, the canopy fragmented. Brettschneider pulled the ejection handles and the canopy blew away. He rolled the jet inverted and fell out, tumbling through the air before his parachute deployed. He landed in a field and watched his Me-262, the revolutionary weapon, the technological marvel, the jet that nothing could catch, burn itself into scrap metal. 12 seconds of combat. That's all his operational career lasted. The final statistics of Me-262 operations tell the story of technological brilliance meeting strategic impossibility. Total produced, 1,443 aircraft. Peak operational strength, 5,100 aircraft at any time. Total Allied aircraft destroyed, 542. Me-262s lost in combat, approximately 100. Me-262s lost to mechanical failure, approximately 150. Me-262s destroyed on the ground, approximately 220. The mathematics were brutal. For every 10 Me-262s produced, only 3 ever saw combat. Of those 3, 1 would be destroyed on the ground, 1 would be lost to mechanical failure, and 1 might survive long enough to shoot down an enemy aircraft. The 5-to-1 kill ratio was impressive, but it was also meaningless. Allied forces flew over 1.5 million bomber and fighter sorties over Germany in 1944-45. The Me-262s managed to destroy 542 aircraft, or 0.036% of the attacking force. Meanwhile, Germany lost the air war, lost the ground war, lost everything. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe effectively ceased to exist. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Airfields were cratered ruins. And the Me-262s, those revolutionary jets that nothing could catch, sat in hangars and on dispersed parking areas, fully functional, but unable to fly because there was no fuel to fill their tanks.
When American and British technical teams swept through Germany in May 1945, capturing factories and research facilities, they found themselves staring at the future. The Me-262 production lines, the Jumo 004 engine specifications, the wind tunnel data showing swept-wing advantages, the targeting systems, the attack tactics, the lessons learned from the world's first operational jet fighter. Allied engineers were stunned by the sophistication. Some technologies were 5 years ahead of equivalent British or American research. The axial flow turbojet design became the template for every jet engine developed afterward. The swept-wing configuration influenced the North American F-86 Sabre,
which would dominate Korean War skies. Soviet MiG-15 designers studied captured Me-262s and incorporated German research into their aircraft. Within 5 years of VE Day, piston fighters became obsolete worldwide. The age of the jet had arrived, exactly as the Me-262 had demonstrated. But there's a darker legacy too. The Me-262 proved that technological superiority alone cannot win wars, that resource shortages can cripple even the most advanced weapons, that timing matters as much as capability, that strategic decisions, good or bad, can nullify tactical advantages. It demonstrated that in total war, industrial capacity and resource availability matter more than engineering brilliance. The Me-262 arrived too late to change World War II's outcome, but it arrived exactly on time to change everything that came after. Every jet fighter developed in the past 80 years traces its lineage back to that sleek German interceptor with swept wings and potted engines. The revolution it triggered didn't save Germany, but it reshaped military aviation for generations. Phoenix, Arizona, 1985. The reunion of German and American fighter pilots brought together former enemies who hadn't seen each other in 40 years. The conference room was filled with men in their 60s and 70s wearing name tags and reminiscing about the war. A young journalist asked Adolf Galland about the Me-262. The former General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighters, paused before answering. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, he said slowly. "We saw American fighters and thought they didn't understand air combat. They were building the wrong aircraft. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans built aircraft designed around production, firepower, and survivability. In a war of attrition, that's what wins." He gestured to the American pilots in the room. But the Me-262, that was something different. "When I first flew it, I knew we had glimpsed the future. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. At altitude, nothing could touch it."
An American pilot, Major Robert Johnson, who had survived that desperate encounter with an Me-262 in 1944, spoke up. "We were terrified of them. When gun camera footage showed the speed those things had, we thought we were obsolete." Galland smiled sadly. "You weren't obsolete. We were desperate. The Me-262 was brilliant engineering wrapped in strategic impossibility. We needed it 3 years earlier. We needed 500 of them, fully fueled with experienced pilots. What we got were 50 jets, barely enough fuel for an hour of flight, and kids with no training." Another German pilot added, "Those engines! God, those engines! They killed as many of us as you did. Every takeoff was a prayer. Every landing was a miracle. But when it worked, when everything came together perfectly, there was nothing like it. You'd close on a bomber formation at 500 miles per hour, fire once. The target would just disintegrate. Then you'd climb away before the escorts could react. For those few moments, you felt invincible. Until you ran out of fuel, or an engine failed, or a P-51 caught you during landing." Galland nodded. "Exactly. The Me-262 was the future arriving before we were ready for it. We had the technology, but not the resources. The capability, but not the infrastructure. The vision, but not the time." The room fell silent for a moment. "Did it matter?" the journalist asked. "In the end, did the Me-262 change anything?" Galland looked at the ceiling, considering. "It didn't change the war, but it changed warfare. Every jet fighter flying today owes something to the Me-262. We proved that jets were viable, that swept wings worked, that speed could trump maneuverability. The Americans and British took our research and built the next generation." He turned to the American pilots. "You won with numbers and resources. We tried to win with technology alone. History shows which approach works." "And what was it like?" Johnson asked. "Flying something that fast? I mean, really, what was it like?" Galland's expression softened, becoming almost wistful. "It was like touching the future with your fingertips.
For those few minutes in the cockpit, Germany wasn't losing the war. The bombers weren't destroying our cities. The Russians weren't at our borders. There was just you, the jet, and the sky. Pure speed, pure power, pure possibility. And then you'd land and remember that the fuel truck was empty, that your mechanics were 16-year-old boys, that tomorrow there might not be any fuel at all. The conversation shifted to other topics, but the question lingered. What if the Me-262 had arrived earlier? What if Germany had prioritized it from the start? What if the engines had been reliable? The answer, most historians agree, is that it wouldn't have mattered. By 1943, Germany was losing on every front. Allied industrial capacity was overwhelming. The resource advantages were insurmountable. The Me-262 might have made victory more expensive for the Allies. It might have delayed the end by months, but it couldn't have changed the fundamental strategic reality. What it did change was aviation history. The jet age that began with the Me-262 in 1944 continues today. Every supersonic fighter, every commercial jet, every military aircraft powered by turbine engines carries forward the lessons learned from that revolutionary German fighter. The Me-262 was the technological marvel that arrived too late to save its creators, but exactly on time to transform the world. Nothing could catch it in level flight during World War II, and nothing could stop the revolution it began.